listening to Mobile ICER, a podcast from the Institute for Community Engaged Research at UBC's Okanagan campus. I'm Dr. Christine Schreyer, a linguistic anthropologist and director of the Institute. This podcast has been produced on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples. We recognize that we are visitors on these lands and thank them for sharing their territory with us. This podcast series on knowledge mobilization was initially recorded at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many, we faced delays in production and distribution, but we're excited to bring these conversations to you now because we feel they are still relevant to those working in knowledge mobilization and in community-engaged research. You might be wondering, what is knowledge mobilization anyway? A knowledge mobilizer is someone who shares their research or knowledge, usually in creative ways, with the appropriate audience. For ICER members, this audience is usually the community that they worked with, or anyone who may be impacted by the research, including the academic community. In each episode, we'll chat with someone who facilitated a workshop for us on a different approach to knowledge mobilization. We are joined by Donna Langille, Community Engagement Librarian at UBC Okanagan, for a discussion about using infographics as a means of data storytelling. Hi, Donna. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To start off, can you tell us a little bit about the concept of data storytelling and what does that mean?
Sure. So data storytelling is communicating information through the use of usually what are infographics, which are a combination of data visualization, so charts, tables, pie charts, as well as images or photographs and text.
Great. So you already described what an infographic is. So can you tell us about why you would create an infographic?
For sure. So deciding whether or not to create an infographic really depends on your audience. So they can be a great way to convey a lot of complex information quickly and clearly. The added benefit of visualizations can make the information easier to understand compared to just using words alone, like in an article. They can also be a lot of fun and engaging, especially when they're designed really well.
Great. So last January, you visited us at ICER and you talked about good practices for developing an infographic. So I remember you talked about storytelling, design, accuracy, and accessibility. So I'm wondering if we could talk about each of those things in a little bit more detail. So what is storytelling is related to infographics?
That's a really good question. So storytelling is really about communicating your key message. Stories really help us connect with people. There are stories all around us, films, books, theaters, even advertisements, our social media feeds. So why shouldn't our research or scholarship be any different? To tell a good story, you often need a beginning, a middle, and an end. So where do you want your audience to start and where do you want them to end up? And it's up to the creator of the infographic to kind of guide the reader through the story and make sure that the reader is able to follow along. So the beginning could be your introduction, and this is where you would set up the topic or the content of the infographic. You might want to consider how you're going to grab your audience's attention. So my background, actually, before I became a librarian, was in filmmaking. And usually at the beginning of a film, you want to start in the middle of the action because that's what's going to draw people in and make them want to watch the rest of the movie. So this could be, if you're doing a research, an academic infographic, this might be where you pose a problem or the context and define what your research question would be.
I was thinking about how arrows are often used in infographics to try to make the story even more clear. And I guess that will get to design, but that's what I've been thinking about as you've been talking.
Yeah, those can be really helpful as well. So after your introduction would be the middle of your story. So this might be your research methodology and results. So how did you try to answer the question and what did you come up with? And how are you going to show this information in a visual way? So this might be where where your data visualizations come in. And then lastly, your conclusion or the end of your story might be a call to action. What are you asking your audience to do with this information? Or why is this information important? I find thinking about storytelling in this way really helps to think up through the formatting of your infographic and making sure that the information is really evenly distributed and succinct.
I'm wondering, so that's a really good sense of how to lay out the story, and I really liked how you tied it to results and methodologies. Do you have a sense, and have you done either way? So in English, we read stories from left to right, but a lot of infographics I see are actually from top to bottom. So do you have a sense of which way is a better way to lay out your story? And I guess that, again, goes to design.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned using arrows to clearly define and show your reader what way to read the information. So you can include design aspects like that. I think reading it from left to right can also be possible in an infographic. So some of the ones that I've included, there might be two panels at the top. So you read left to right and then down. Another way to help with this, especially for accessibility, is to include things like headers and subheadings. So you can do that when you're creating a PDF. You can actually mark up the text so that if a screen reader is reading it, they'll be able to know the logical sequence of events.
Oh, great point. Yes, I keep forgetting about screen readers and alt text and all that. So other design features, if you're just going to start out your first infographic, what are some things you should think about in terms of design?
Yeah, so I'm not a graphic designer by any means, but something that I like to pay attention to is just accessibility and making sure that you're communicating your information in a way that is going to reach as many people as possible. So what I would recommend is probably a minimalist design. So a lot of the infographic tools out there are so much fun and they give you so many things to play around with, different images, colors, layouts. But if we add too much, it can be really off-putting as a reader and oftentimes not very accessible. So I would choose a small color scheme and remember to use contrasting colors with fonts and backgrounds. Another common mistake is adding too much information, especially text. And this can be kind of difficult when you're using a lot of qualitative data. But infographics are engaging because they rely on visuals and are quick to read. So if you add too much information, perhaps an infographic isn't the best way to communicate your story. And then I would also suggest really thinking about your audience. So are you hoping that the infographic will be read by a general audience? So if this is the case, you might want to remember to keep your language simple and try and keep out any jargon or uncommon words. And then above all else, I would really recommend following accessibility guidelines and best practices so that your infographic can be enjoyed by as many people as possible.
Oh, those are really great tips. So you mentioned minimalist design, and I really appreciate that fact. And so you mentioned some of these other tools you can use to make infographics, and you mentioned a few of those when you met with us in January. Can you tell us about what some of those tools are?
Sure. So a lot of these are available on the internet. So there's Piktochart and Canva is the other one that I use. There are a few more that are out there. You can also use things like Photoshop or any sort of like illustration tool. There's tons available for iPads and tablets. The two that I've used, Piktochart and Canva, they do have a membership that doesn't cost anything, although you may want to see if they keep any of your data. And these programs are really about dragging and dropping different aspects of the infographic. So if you're not a graphic designer like me, they're a great way to kind of start out and get used to kind of different ways to format text. And a lot of these also have built-in data visualization features. So they make the charts right in the program. So as long as you have the data, you can input those numbers and it'll make something hopefully visually pleasing.
That sounds exactly like what I need. I am not a graphic designer either, and I really like visual information, but I find it hard to translate things myself, so that would be very helpful for me. Are there copyright issues? I guess if you're using a program, then you don't need to worry about any copyrights of the visualizations that you're using or images that you're using.
That's a really good question. So, for example, I use the Pro version of Canva, and built into that program are images that are available via Unsplash. So a lot of those are not copyrighted. But creating your infographic, that's something you definitely want to keep in mind, is that are you using any images or icons that are copyrighted, and do you have the permission to use those? And I would say that that is something that the library can really help with. So if you're creating an infographic and you have questions about copyright or proper citation or attribution, definitely reach out to the library.
Great, thank you. Okay, so what are the other things you mentioned? And you've already talked about accessibility, but what about accuracy? So when you're talking about accuracy, are you talking about accuracy of the data, or what are we talking about with accuracy?
Yeah, accuracy of the data is really important. And I know it sounds maybe something that's a little bit more intuitive, but you'd actually be surprised how many people actually forget to maybe double check that their pie charts add up correctly. So it's a common mistake, but it's easily avoidable. It's just good to kind of remember to double check those sorts of things. I've made those mistakes in my infographics, so
Yeah. I feel like in the era of fake news, we're all supposed to be highly attuned to these accuracy things, and it's, harder to find but to pay attention to adding up to 100. It's good advice.
yeah, especially if you're planning to share it out into the world, it's always good to kind of double check or have someone else look over it first.
Good point. Absolutely. The other thing that you mentioned briefly was accessibility. And so can you, just for those who don't know what you mean by that, can you give a definition of accessibility? And you've already mentioned a few things that make things more accessible, but if there's any other tips you have on that?
Yeah, so an accessible infographic is one where the content can be read by a screen reader or assistive technology. So I mentioned that earlier. Screen readers interpret what is on the screen and use text to speech to convey the information to the user. So it's very important to design accessibility into the infographic, because not all infographic formats are accessible or can be read by screen readers. So for example, image files like JPEG or PNGs require alt text or alternate text description. So you can't see this description on the screen, but a screen reader will be able to read it and describe the image. So infographics usually contain too much information to have descriptive alt text, although you may want to provide alt text for the images embedded within the infographic. If it's not possible to make your infographic an accessible PDF, then you might want to consider writing a transcript of your information and including that wherever you post or share your image file. I've done that in the past when I've only been able to create an image of the infographic. So this might be due to the type of program you use. Maybe you're only able to download it as a JPEG. So what I've done is I've either embedded a link to a transcript wherever I'm planning to kind of display it or show it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. So those tools that you mentioned earlier, like Canva and Pictochart, they're able to make these accessible versions of infographics?
So if you're able to download it as a PDF, which I know the Canva Pro membership allows you to do, you can add accessibility markup tags using something like Adobe Acrobat Professional Pro. If you're new to this, because it can be a bit overwhelming if you've never tried to use the accessibility features, the Universal Design Center at California State University has a lot of great information on their website, and they actually have a PDF accessibility checklist.
That's really good to know. We'll try to find a link to that, and we can put that into our link when we post this podcast, if you don't mind sharing that with us.
Of course. Yeah, and then there's a few other best practices that you could include in the design of your infographic. So making sure that the font is a readable size and style and not too small. So some of the handwriting fonts can be a bit difficult to read. Trying to avoid using color to convey meaning, because there are folks who are color deficient and won't be able to understand that information. Using a contrast between the background and the text color. So sometimes it's really fun to use different color schemes, but sometimes it's easier to just have white background with a darker colored text. And then also, if you're going to include links into your infographic, making sure those links are easily identifiable. And then, like I mentioned, using alt text to describe any images. And there's also a lot of resources online to learn how to write effective alt text.
Great. You mentioned having the links really easily accessible or found. What about using QR codes? Is that a thing that people are still doing these days? I know they were very popular for a while. But what are your thoughts on QR codes on infographics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never actually used any QR codes on my infographics, so I can't speak to the accessibility of them. Just that I have seen them used. So I imagine they're still around, but I would definitely look into seeing if there's any sort of accessibility guidelines for incorporating those.
Yeah, I've used them. Students of mine have used them for recruiting for research participants, like when you have your poster to recruit. And I know there are very fancy, complex things you can do with QR codes in terms of making a custom image inside of it and things like that. But I don't know about the accessibility feature. So something to look into in the future, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so before we move on, is there anything that I haven't asked you about data storytelling and infographics that you think people should know?
I think really the only thing I'd like to kind of mention is if anyone at UBCO is thinking about infographics or data storytelling, is curious about it, wants to learn more, isn't maybe sure where to start, I'm definitely available for help. So they're more than welcome to reach out to me. Even if they just want to talk about it or maybe see some examples, I'm happy to help.
Great. That's really good to know because I might be doing that in the future. Yeah, so I'm feeling like I could do it but I might have questions about making my own. So I'm going to switch focus slightly now since this podcast season is focused on knowledge mobilization. We're asking all of our guests a couple of questions about that. So what does knowledge mobilization mean to you?
Wow. So I'm very excited about knowledge mobilization, or it's sometimes called knowledge exchange as well. As I mentioned, I'm the community engagement librarian, so I'm very lucky. I get to work with a lot of community members in my day-to-day work. And I've experienced firsthand the amazing outcomes that can happen when communities are included as partners from the beginning of projects. And when all knowledge, including lived experience, for example, is valued and respected. So I really believe that everyone should have equitable access to information. And I think one of the ways that we can work towards that is by making research and scholarship open, public, and accessible. So I hope that we start to see an increase of different ways to communicate our research that go beyond publishing articles in a closed, paywalled academic journal.
Absolutely. That was very well said. In fact, I almost want to take your definition and stick it back in the beginning.
It's a hard thing to define though. I find that's something that I've been struggling with too, because I'm really interested in community engagement, but you often see it kind of used
Interchangeably, yeah.
interchangeably. Yes, that's the word.
Yeah.
You see them both used interchangeably. But they seem like different words, and I'm trying to look into kind of what it means to do knowledge mobilization versus community engagement. Can you do one without the other? What's the relationship between the two? And how are these different than just, say, doing outreach to a community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for ISER members, obviously we're the Institute for Community Engaged Research. So much of our research is actually engaging community members at the very beginning, and then mobilizing that knowledge with the community, where a lot of other people are doing more knowledge translation. That's another term, right? Where they take their very formal academic jargonese and then try to translate it for community, which is not what we do so much. We do more of knowledge exchange or knowledge mobilization. So I think thinking about the different ways that people are engaging is important too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that I've tried to carry with me throughout my role as community engagement librarian is really, like you mentioned, including community partners from the beginning, and not doing anything about the community without the community is something that I really try to think critically about as I do my work.
Has there been anyone you worked with who was doing a really cool knowledge mobilization project that you've been involved with in your time so far?
Well, I would say that there is stuff that is happening. I think what I'm most excited for at this particular moment is kind of seeing where podcasting goes, which I know is an interest of yours and ISER. I'm really excited about the Amplify Podcast Network, which is Canada's first scholarly podcast network. It's a partnership between SFU Publishing Program, the DH Innovation Lab, Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and I believe the Documentary Media Society. And so I think that's a really great opportunity. I hope it inspires more people to engage in podcasting, because it's one of those mediums where people can really reach a wider audience. And I think that we're starting to see a lot more support for developing out those podcasts at universities as well.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for telling me who all is involved in that. I've heard snippets of it on the radio talking about this new podcast network developing, and I didn't know all the partners. So that was really interesting and definitely something that we at ISER support. And we are going to be talking about podcasting on our podcast in the future as well. So speaking of podcasts, what podcasts are you listening to these days?
I always get really nervous about this question because I feel like I should have a list of all these amazing podcasts, but I I don't really have the time to listen to them as much as I would like. And I'm kind of one of those people that listens to the same one over and over again. So my favorite, the one that actually got me interested in podcasts was Witch Please, which is produced by Hannah McGregor and Marcel Cosman. And they're actually renewing it this year. So I'm excited about that coming, I think, in September, the new season. And then this summer, actually, I've been listening to, I've been wanting to listen to podcasts that will make me laugh or relax a little bit. I think everyone kind of needs a little bit of that right now. So I've been listening to,
Yeah, we do.
So I've been listening to a lot of The Office Ladies, which is a rewatch podcast of The Office with two of the actresses that starred on it. And one of the things that I really like about it is it's just two best friends talking and laughing, and it just makes me feel good to listen to. So that's what I've been listening to this summer. I also wanted to mention the UBCO Library podcast Frequency. So I'm currently working on a season. The topic of this season is community, which I think will be really of interest to knowledge mobilization folks. So yeah.
That sounds great. We'll look forward to seeing that. You said Witch Please, but you didn't tell us what Witch Please is about. So I know what Witch Please is about, but could you tell us all about Witch Please as well?
Yes, yeah. So Witch Please is a podcast about the Harry Potter series. So it's featuring two lady scholars, as they call themselves, and they take a very feminist, critical lens to the Harry Potter films and movies. And they go through each of the books and each of the movies, as well as a few other episodes. So it's a very critical take on the series, and also features two best friends kind of talking and laughing and having fun, which I've just realized is something that I'm really into. And for podcasts, is just listening to two friends, feeling like you're sitting in their living room with them, chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Good. Well, we look forward to seeing Frequencies come out from UBCO Library. And are there past seasons of Frequencies we can also find?
Yes, there is. And I can give you a link too if you'd like to link to that as well. I believe we're on season 5.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know there were that many seasons. That's really cool. Okay.
They're small seasons, but there's some really great episodes featuring people from the UBCO community.
Great. And where can people find out more about your work besides Frequencies or other things that you're doing?
Yeah, so I would say the best way to kind of reach out is through email. So it's donna.langille@ubc.ca. And I'm definitely interested in hearing from folks at the UBCO community who are interested in knowledge mobilization, community engagement, data storytelling, podcasting, anything like that. If you have any questions related to those types of activities or just want someone to chat to about those, then please reach out.
Great. And if someone has an idea for community engagement involving the library, they can also reach out to you in some way.
Definitely. Yes. Please send me an email.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and being on our podcast and sharing all of your ideas for best practices around infographics and data storytelling. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will as well.
Thank you.
My pleasure. You've been listening to Mobile ICER, a podcast from the Institute for Community Engaged Research at UBC's Okanagan campus. Produced by Joanne Carey, Christine Schreyer, Robin Metcalf, Madeline Lekai, and Kaylee Fawcett. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Dr. Christine Schreyer. Edited by Kaylee Fawcett. Music by Pictures of a Floating World and Scott Holmes. Artwork by Madeline Lekai. Thank you for listening.